Language is necessary. It's necessary for human development.
Welcome to Talking About Kids. I am your host, R. Bradley Snyder, researcher, activist, and author of The 5 Simple Truths of Raising Kids. More than half of all deaf students who graduate from high school have reading skills at or below the 4th grade level. Research indicates that low literacy makes it difficult for individuals to obtain or maintain any employment, let alone the kind of employment that affords independence, a house, and a family. For well over a decade, Donna Jo Napoli, my guest this episode, and her colleagues have been publishing articles on why deaf students seem to have this literacy deficit. As you will learn, Donna Jo places the blame firmly on a care system that emphasizes technology and convenience over techniques that actually support early language acquisition and social and emotional development. Donna Jo is a professor of linguistics and social justice at Swarthmore College, the author of fiction and science books, and the co-director of RISE Videobooks. In this two-part episode, Donna Jo and I discuss what can be done to improve the cognitive health of deaf children. This first part focuses on early language and cognitive development. The second part focuses more on what Donna Jo and others are doing to improve reading skills. Talking About Kids is sponsored in part by the Arizona Department of Health Services Must Stop Bullying campaign through its Title V Maternal and Child Health Program. For more information, go to muststopbullying.org. If you know somebody who would benefit from a better approach to supporting deaf students, please like this episode and then share it with them. And now, the interview.
I grew up in a very poor family. And when I was 9 years old, I had a terrible experience in school. Um, it was the beginning of 4th grade, and the teacher accused me of cheating. It was a math test. It was the second week of school. I liked math. Um, and she wrote the test on the blackboard. We had always had mimeograph sheets. I'm quite old. And I asked the child in front of me, the boy in front of me, what was written on the board. And he kept shrugging his shoulder, and she came up and lifted me literally by the shoulder and stood me in front of the class and said I was the worst kind of person. I was a cheater. And she made me stand in the hall all day long and tell everybody that passed that I was there because I was a cheater. I cried most of the day. And I went home with a note from my mother that said I was a cheater. And my mother gave it to my father, who called up my grandfather and borrowed money and took me to an ophthalmologist. I had never been to a doctor in my life. And the ophthalmologist said I was legally blind and probably had been since birth. So just about anything more than 10 feet away was very blurry for me. And I got glasses. Um, it took 2 weeks to get glasses in those days, and they were big, thick Coke bottle bottom type glasses,
Right.
and they made the bridge of my nose bleed, they made my ears bleed, and I loved them. I could see the world, and I became an avid reader, and, all my whole life, I had been the stupid, clumsy one. I was always falling, banging into things, and I never knew what was going on. And now suddenly I had a different world. And I was very happy, and I went on, and very soon I got contact lenses because which my grandfather also paid for, because my eyes just kept getting worse. Um, and then eventually, as an adult, I've had some surgeries. Whatever, I see quite well now, but I don't drive. I don't do things like that. I don't want to kill anyone. um, um, I became a linguist. I always loved languages. My grandmother lived with me when we were little, and she spoke only Italian, and she always told stories, and um, I didn't always understand them, but I laughed when she laughed. Whatever, I became a linguist, and at one point, a student said to me, "How do deaf kids learn to read?"
Hmm.
And so I went with her. We visited a deaf kindergarten, a mainstreamed kindergarten. We visited it many times a week for several weeks in the fall semester of that year. And by the end of it, I was convinced that it was an incredibly difficult thing for a to learn how to read in a language that you don't speak, that you don't hear, when most writing systems are set up uh, as alphabets, and
Hmm.
alphabets have a relationship between the symbol and sound. But if you don't get sound, there's no relationship there. It's much more like a character system where the character relates to a whole sense, a whole meaning, and that's what deaf kids are doing. It's like they're learning to read a character system, but even worse, they're learning to read a character system in a language they don't know. Very, very complicated. If you meet a literate deaf person, have a lot of respect. They have worked hard to
Right.
get to that point. Um, And I knew immediately that I cared about this. I wasn't sure how I could do anything about it, but I cared about it. So I jumped into deaf studies, and I started learning some things about sign languages, and I made many deaf friends. And I write stories for children.
Hmm.
Um, when I became a reader, it's like my whole world opened up. I could be anywhere, do anything. Um, I remember when I went to college, I never expected to go to college. I had a full scholarship, complete. They gave me a budget for laundry that was more than I spent on clothes in a year, because I
Mm.
always got my clothes from the St. Vincent de Paul box for the poor. But anyway, my first year at break between semesters, which was a 5-day break, it was strange. We ended our semester in January. Um, the girls on my hall got together and flew to Switzerland to go skiing. I, of course, did not go, but I did not need to go because I was Heidi. I had grown up on an Alm in Switzerland. I knew all about
Right.
Switzerland. I was every kid and every book I'd ever read. And I loved that. And I wanted to give that to children. So I've been writing books for children for years and years. Anyway, in 2011, uh, yeah, in 2012, Apple came out with iBooks Author. It was the
Hmm.
first free program to make video books. And a friend of mine who teaches at Gallaudet grabbed me by the hand and said, let's take my students at Gallaudet and your students at Swarthmore, and let's make video books for deaf children. So we tried. He used to work in the American Theater, the National Theater of the Deaf. So he had a great commitment to storytelling, particularly for deaf children. And I have a passion for storytelling. So you put us together, we had this foundation. Also, he's a linguist and I'm a linguist. So we were coming at the issue from the same perspective. Um, and that's what we did. We started classes. and our students made books for deaf children. Now, how does this tie into education? Um, I don't have a degree in education, and Jean Myris, my partner at Gallaudet, does not have a degree in education. In fact, we know very little about how to teach deaf children to read. What we know about is factors that correlate with good reading skills.
Okay.
And theories of education change like in any field, they change over the years. But the one thing that holds steady and has held steady for nearly 50 years now in studies is the correlation between being a good reader and enjoying sharing books when you're little. If somebody takes you and sits down and shares a book with you and you have fun doing it, it's not as though they're pointing to the words and saying, that's the, this is boat, whatever. Um, it's just that you're having fun. You enjoy it. You look forward to it. That provides a motivation. It convinces you that stories are worth it, and
Hmm.
therefore learning to read is worth it. And that shared reading activity experience, which seems so minor, is actually very sophisticated. When you talk about the characters and what they're doing, I always like to use examples of a bunny and a fox. You've got a book with a bunny and a fox, and the bunny sees the fox and starts running. And you ask the child, why did that happen? You get into what's the world like? What's a bunny's life like?
Right.
What's a fox's life like? And why, when they see each other, would anything happen at all? That's important if you're going to learn to read. It helps if you have some knowledge about the world to start with, because reading is a an active, creative, cognitive experience. You are bringing your knowledge of the world and your experience with the world to bear on how you understand what you read. So the more you know about the world, the richer the reading experience is. And when you say, there's a hole over there, what do you think the bunny's going to do? Um, you're asking the child to make some inferences. You're asking
Hmm.
them to put themselves in the body of the bunny and say, what would I do if a fox was chasing me? And that's a huge thing too, because there's a thing called theory of mind.
Hmm.
And in education, it's a big deal. And most children, by the time they are perhaps 4, have a pretty developed theory of mind. But deaf children don't. That's some place where they fall down. But the children who have been read to, who have had books shared with them, have a developed theory of mind. It's crucial for understanding characterization in fiction. And those inferences, if you can guess what's going to happen next and you turn the page and it happens, it makes reading that page a lot easier. Um, Many times you turn the page and there's a surprise, but not always. And particularly if you're reading, I'm talking about fiction now, but you read nonfiction. Nonfiction is a story too.
Hmm.
Nonfiction has a beginning, it develops something, it has an ending, and inferences play a huge part in understanding nonfiction. If you teach the child how to make inferences, if they are learning that through a shared reading activity, then you've helped them. So all these things are pre-literacy skills. Plus, you're sitting there, parent and child together. You're sharing language, you're sharing an experience. When you talk about who's a good reader and who isn't, and you
Hmm.
see charts, they almost never list deaf children. But if they did, they'd be off the bottom of the chart. Deaf children are behind their hearing peers in academics pretty much across the board, and that's regardless of whether or not they have a cochlear implant, and regardless of whether or not they are bilaterally implanted. Deaf children just are behind. Um,
And
so
let me pause you right there for just a moment because I do want to give my listeners a little bit of background because you're moving into why I sought you out to begin with, and that is because I came across an article from July 10th, 2024, in the Harm Reduction Journal that you and your co-authors wrote, and it's entitled "An Approach Designed to Fail Deaf Children and Their Parents and How to Change It." And in it, you make kind of four accusations against kind of the larger healthcare education world about ways that they are failing deaf children and their parents. And this gets at this issue that you're about to bring up here because you believe, if I'm not mistaken, in my reading of not only this article, but then this was a if I'm not mistaken, this was a update of an article that you and a couple of those other authors wrote back in 2012, and all of you have been writing on your own and in combination before then and since then about how these failures are keeping deaf children behind. And you make four accusations. You say that there's a failure to inform families of all of the research and options that are available for deaf children. That there is a you say this misinforming is kind of coercing families into certain options at the expense of kind of the entirety of options that are available to them. And when the options that they're coerced into fail their children, of course, what you then say is that they have this abnegation of trust, your words, and that because they've relied on the system to help their deaf children and the system failed them, now they don't trust the system. And also the misinformation and coercing towards certain options for certain children at the expense of letting families know about all the options also exposes deaf children to many risks, health risks that I've read about, again, because of your publications and those of your colleagues, and an overdependency. And those are your accusations, but why you are making them is because you point out that the result is we are setting these children behind off the bat. They're behind in their academic and social and emotional development because of these failures. Am I getting that right, Donna Jo? Did I do an okay job summarizing that? What did I leave out?
you did an amazing job. I tend to talk and talk and talk, and you did it
Mhm,
so quickly, so beautifully. Um, One of the things that we as a society don't know much about is
mhm,
first language acquisition. Teachers are not taught about it in education schools by
yeah,
and large. Even in medical schools, people are not taught about it. It's like it is not considered to be a health issue or an
yeah,
educational issue. On the other hand, it is.
mhm,
So when you are born, if you look at the behavior of newborns, they are dying to learn. They are just reaching out. Language is everything. And you don't have to teach them it. A hearing baby in a hearing environment does not need to be taught how to speak.
right,
Instead, They acquire it, they absorb it. It's we have evolved to be sponges with respect to language.
Hmm.
By the time a child is 6 months old, a hearing child, you might well be able to stand near the light switch and say, "Do you want to turn on the light?" And the kid might reach out and turn on the light. Um, you Children are showing so much understanding of language really early, even if the average age for articulating a spoken word that a stranger can understand is 10 months. It's clear that children are understanding and babbling and doing all kinds of things before that. By the time a child is 2 years old, some children are still saying single words, and maybe other people outside the family don't understand them. Some children are saying whole sentences, um, but they are all understanding a terrific amount. And by the time they're 4, they've got it in place, really totally in place. And the thing that it happens is that it didn't start on day 0. It actually started in the womb.
Hmm.
We know that babies are hearing in the womb at least by 7 months and maybe much earlier. And they tune into the rhythms, what's called the prosody of the language of the mother or in the language of the people around the mother.
Mm.
So that when they're born, within the first couple of days of life, if someone enters the room speaking a language that is not the mother's language, they don't look, their eye gaze doesn't go toward it. But if
Mm.
someone comes in speaking the language of the mother, their eye gaze goes toward it. They already they didn't know it was language, but it's something that they are attuned to. And then of course, once they're actually born and out in the world, then they're quickly tuning into what communication is all about. This is how first language acquisition works. With a deaf child, if you have a deaf child born into a deaf signing family
Okay.
or a hearing signing family, if they're born into a signing environment, they did not see any of the world before they were born. So they're starting on day 0, but they start on day 0 with a bang. And we find that the first language milestones for deaf children in a signing environment are very close to the first language milestones for a speaking child, for a hearing child in a speaking environment, with the exception of when you learn to articulate your first word that strangers recognize. And for deaf children, it's 8 months, while for hearing children, it's 10 months. For speaking children, it's 10 months. And that's not because deaf children are smarter. That's because the articulators that we use in signing are larger and we gain control over them
Right.
earlier, motor control. So, as far as we know today, um, sign languages and spoken languages are cognitively um, completely adequate for
Hmm.
communicating everything that human beings need to communicate to each other. They are they are equal linguistic citizens. However, when a baby is born, when you have a newborn, we can't test the hearing of the newborn in the womb. So when they are born, if it is determined that they are not hearing, if they are not responding to those early tests usually take place within the first 24 hours of birth, those tests for hearing. When you find that they are not responding, and then they'll do a test again 2 weeks later to see whether it was just that the ears were clogged up with something, some kind of liquid or whatever. And then it's confirmed, and then there'll usually be more tests. What happens is the hearing parents, a typical situation is a medical professional will say, "I'm sorry to tell you
Mm,
that your child has been diagnosed um, with hearing loss. And don't be upset though, because we have a cure. We have cochlear implants. They can restore hearing, and your child will be a hearing person." Now, I've said it in very simple terms, but that is pretty much the gist of what a lot of medical professionals tell parents of deaf
right.
newborns. And so much of it is wrong. Um, Saying, "I'm sorry to
Mm,
tell you," is as though your child has an illness. Nobody dies from being deaf. It is not an illness. It is an auditory status. It is not a diagnosis. It is
mm,
not an illness. It is a status. Your child is not receiving auditory information. That's how it should be presented. But hopefully, you've got a beautifully healthy child here. Um, Enjoy the great um, wonder of life that has wound up in your family. But there are needs that this child has in a speaking environment that a hearing child would not have. So you have to make sure that your child has access to language. What is language? Language is so much more than just these words that we create.
right.
Language is a cognitive facility, and language allows us to make a connection between two kind of arbitrary things, either the sound of something and what it means, or the look of something and what it means. It's an abstract connection, and making that connection very young builds our cognitive abilities. It allows us, believe it or not, to do mathematical
Hmm.
activities. They are built on that association. If you don't make that kind of association quite young, it makes things like counting to 100 difficult. It makes counting your change difficult. It makes knowing how many people there are in a line difficult. Um, it can make you seem stupid when in
Hmm.
fact what you are is someone who is missing a particular kind of ability.
Right. And so let me pause you again right there because uh, I really want to unpack some of that because it is, longtime listeners of talking about kids are going to be well aware of attachment. So that comes up a lot on in this program. So if you're a new listener and you need a primer on attachment theory, you can go back and listen to our episodes with Deb Pepler. We did a very deep dive on what attachment is there. But we also talk a lot about the building blocks of resilience on talking about kids. So we know a lot about, we have plenty of episodes on childhood trauma and on building resilience. But before I do, again, in reading your writing and in reading that of your colleagues, there's this thing that happens, and I need to connect the dots to my listeners, and I'm going to include links to your writings so that they can go and access them themselves. But when that doctor says, "I'm sorry," and then keeps going, and then they say, "But we have this wonderful new cochlear implant technology," right? This other thing that you and your colleagues point out also happens. So it's not, and I want to make it explicit. It was implicit in what you just said, Donna Joe, but I want to make sure that my listeners understand where the problem is. Too often, according to you and your colleagues, the doctor then says, maybe explicitly, maybe implicitly, so, just wait until they have the cochlear implant, and then you can start communicating with the child. And there's a couple problems with that. The one is the one that we're talking about now, which is that too often, according to your research, that's what the parent does is they actually don't try sign language or other ways of communicating with the child, waiting for that implant. And then the second problem with this over reliance on the cochlear implant is that it is not without dangers or harm to especially young children who receive the procedure. So, have I gotten both of those points correct?
Absolutely. Um, if you're a parent who is hearing and your baby is deaf and you're told you have this other option that will make your baby be hearing, or you could learn sign language if you want. Um, it's very frightening for a parent to be told they have to learn a new language. We
Yeah.
all know that once you're a teenager, once you're past the age of 12, once bilateralization of the brain is over, it's really hard to learn another language. You have to study it, you have to be motivated. How much time do parents have to learn a new language? They can feel very frightened and discouraged by that. And they're often told it's your choice. It's very bad for them to be told it's your choice. It's like it's as irresponsible as telling a parent of a diabetic child that it's their choice whether or not
Mm.
they give that child um, the medication that the child needs. Language is necessary. It's necessary for human development. It's necessary for your cognitive health. And if you don't have language, which many deaf people around the world don't have language.
Mm.
If you don't have language, you have a shorter life expectancy, you have worse health outcomes, you are more likely to be involved in crime, either as a victim or a perpetrator.
Mhm.
So many things are wrong about it. Language is how we make friends. It's how we fall in love. Language is how we learn about the world.
Mhm.
Like, if you learned about the world only by the senses that you have that are working, you could only learn about what's available to you. Um,
It limits your imagination. The greater the number of ways that you have to communicate as a human, the greater your imagination, the greater amount of thoughts you're capable of having.
um, yeah, and I don't do that kind of research. Um, but we do know in the kind of research that I work on that multilingualism, no matter how good or bad you are at these other languages, makes you a more creative
Mhm.
problem solver. You consider more possibilities. Further, it makes you better at
Mhm.
collaboration. I think that's incredibly important. I think that we tend to say, oh, this person's a genius, that person discovered XYZ. Well, you know what? This person over there was also working on XYZ and was just a month behind. Like, most of our work comes out of looking at all the work that's been done. We are collaborating with each other at some level, and to celebrate only one person's work is misguided. We learn, we do better
Mhm.
work when we work with other people. Yeah, so I would like to return to these parents who are told they have to learn a
Right.
sign language because they get scared. They think, I can't do it very well. And what if I do it badly and I teach my child to sign badly? But I just encourage them, look at immigrants, look at immigrant families. the little kids in those families, maybe they came over when they were 4 or 5 or whatever. Maybe they were born here. Maybe they were 10, whatever. You put them in a school with other kids who are speaking the language of the new country, and within 6 months, nobody knows they're an
Right.
immigrant. They don't learn the new language from their parents. They learn it from their peers. And if you take sign language lessons as a family, and if you make a connection with the deaf community and you expose your deaf child to signing by deaf people as often as you can, your baby's going to be fine. It doesn't matter whether you're a really lousy signer. It really doesn't matter. It matters that you communicate with your child, and your child is going to learn
Mhm.
your sign for X, even if at school or with other friends they use a different sign for X. Um, that's just how it is.
It's so important. Again, am I reading too much into this? Again, because I am more familiar with the attachment literature. When I think of early childhood communication, even before we have that ability to perspective take, even before our brain allows us to have that to do the perspective taking, what we are learning is efficacy. We're learning that we can get our needs met. We're learning that other people can help us when we're hungry, when we're scared, when we are uncomfortable, when we just don't know what's going on. And so, in reading your writing, I got terribly, terribly anxious for these deaf children whose parents were told not only, and again, you're kind of being kind because some of the stories that are in your writing and those of your colleagues are people in the medical establishment saying, do not sign with them because it will slow down their acquisition of spoken language. And so now you have these very young children that are struggling to get their needs met. And I know what that does to a human as they grow. Um, and again, we talk about the building blocks of resilience. If you don't know how to get your own needs met, that makes for one heck of an anxious individual. So let's talk again about that myth that if you are teaching multiple languages, that you're actually slowing down language acquisition, because there is a lot of myths around that, isn't there?
Yes, and we have myths about spoken
Hmm.
languages too. We tend to think it's a lot easier to learn Spanish than to learn Chinese. We have absolutely no evidence that that's true. If a family moves to South America, to Argentina, with a 4-year-old, that child learns Spanish. If you move to China with a 4-year-old, and you're from the United States, that children learns Mandarin or whatever the local language that the children that they're playing with use. That's what's going to happen. And this the it's essentially a very deeply rooted prejudice
Mm.
that there's something wrong with sign languages, that they aren't as good as spoken languages. And I don't know what to do about that. It's simply wrong. Um, And just like learning Spanish does not interfere with your continuing to use English at home, if that's what the family is using, learning a sign language does not interfere with your learning to speak in English or any other spoken language if there is motivation for it. A child who's deaf does have to work harder at with a cochlear implant. They do have to work harder at learning to speak. They are not relying solely on that cochlear implant. If you put masks over people's faces, like what happened during COVID, deaf kids with a cochlear implant that was understanding their parents speaking Now they can't understand them. In other words, they were relying on all kinds of
Yeah.
information about how the mouth moves, how the cheeks move, how the head moves as you're speaking. That was when you talk about um, we find ways to get around the all of us have impediments, all of us have shortcomings in one thing or another, and we find ways to get around them. When I was a little kid, the doctor said to my mother, I'm amazed she wasn't killed crossing the street. Well, I wasn't killed crossing the street because I knew I was stupid. So I would wait on the corner until somebody else came along, and when they crossed, I crossed with them. I knew that, I found a way to get around it. Children find ways to get around things, but they have to have a motivation. It has to be worth it. Um, in fact, I should say, even if daddy grows a beard, like you have a mustache and a beard, if daddy grows a beard, suddenly they can't understand daddy. And they were communicating with daddy fine
Oh,
before.
wow.
So they really are relying on this. Further, cochlear implants. Okay, you receive information. All of us receive. Those who are hearing receive information, and we don't know what's language and what
Right.
isn't language, and yet very early. Oh, within the first 6 months of life, we distinguish human language from all other sounds, no matter how rhythmic or not those other sounds may
Mm.
be. We distinguish them. We know what's language and what isn't. It is a tricky and difficult thing to do. And deaf kids who receive a cochlear implant, they're not supposed to receive it till 2 years old, but many receive it at a year and a half. Sometimes doctors even do this surgery on 1-year-old babies. It's still too late. It's too late for them, and they have a lot of trouble actively, consciously trying to learn to distinguish language sounds from other
Right.
sounds. So you put a child with a cochlear implant who's doing very well in a room, a silent room with just you and just the child and you, and you're speaking to the child and they're understanding you. You turn your head away, and of course then they don't understand you. But you turn on you have some other noise in the room. You have an air conditioner going, and you have a classroom. Classrooms are full of noise. The deaf child with a cochlear implant is often really in trouble in a classroom. So, what we find is that deaf children who are signers, who know what language is, who have a cochlear implant, become better at speech than deaf children who have a cochlear implant who don't
Fascinating.
sign. And it makes perfect sense.
Yes.
They know what language is. They know
Yep.
what someone is trying to tell them, that because of the context and everything, and they work it out.
And they know what it's capable of.
Yes.
So they've had success with a communication. And so, we again, again, longtime listeners, they probably are sick of me saying this, but it's in all the research, and you've heard it from all the guests. It's success breeds success. So if I'm hearing you right and reading your work correctly, if they find success in sign, they are going to believe that there is success in spoken language as well, and they're going to be like have an additional motivation.
And, if they have playmates, if
Yeah,
they have hearing playmates and it's fun to be with that person, then that gives them a lot of motivation to want to learn to speak. There's no way that watch a little child learning to ride a two-wheel bike. They will get on that bike and they will fall off and they will climb back on and they will fall off and they'll climb back on over and over. Why? Because the thrill of riding that bike is so wonderful. They want that. If speaking is giving them some kind of success, then they're going to work at it. It's not like because they sign, they're not going to work at it. Signing isn't working with this other kid. Okay, let me speak. If speaking is giving them nothing, if they're getting nothing from the other kid, then if you're not giving them sign, they're not getting language.
Yeah.
And then you are harming your child.
That was part 1 of my discussion with Donna Jo Napoli. Please be on the lookout for part 2. More information about Donna Jo, her books, the research we discussed, and RISE Videobooks is at talkingaboutkids.com. The Talking About Kids theme song is by the Senators. For more of their music, go to thesenatorsmusic.com. And remember, kids are young goats and young humans, and the difference is that young goats are easier to manage.